Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, where we'll be discussing how you can use real-time monitoring to minimize fraud losses with greater efficiency while maintaining a secure yet positive experience for your trusted customers. My name is Elena, and I am the product marketing lead at Unit21. I'll be moderating our conversation today. For those of you who aren't familiar with Unit21, we provide infrastructure to detect, investigate, and report bad actors throughout the customer lifecycle. We offer tools and advanced analytics to help organizations fight fraud, money laundering, and other illicit activities. Before we kick things off, we have a few housekeeping reminders. First, this session is being recorded and will be emailed to everyone on this call in the next 24 hours. Second, at the end of the session, we'll host a live Q&A. So please submit any questions you have during the session via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So why are we here today? In today's fast-paced world, the demand for instant access to funds emphasizes the importance that every second counts for both consumers and businesses. However, real-time payments pose a unique challenge for organizations attempting to separate valid transactions from potential fraud. Specifically, we'll be jumping into a few key areas. First, we'll start with a quick recap of market conditions that are driving real-time payments and real-time monitoring. Next, we'll draw the distinctions between fraud detection and fraud prevention and what those implications are. We'll then outline the current challenges with the majority of real-time monitoring solutions before we transition into real-time monitoring with Unit21 and how our customer row is preventing fraud today with our solution. Before we introduce our speakers, you should see a poll pop up on the bottom of your screen. Please select a response that best reflects your interests. While we're waiting for the poll to conclude, let's meet today's hosts. Our hosts for today will be Alex, Kenneth, and Ria. Alex, let's learn more about you.
Thank you, Elena, and welcome everyone to all our global audience. My name is Alex Flevosovic. I am the head of fraud risk here at Unit21, fraud prevention practitioner for the past 15 years, hold various positions in fraud operation, analytics, in traditional banking and fintech as well. Today, I'm leading the fraud practice here at Unit21, working with the product team, with the marketing team, and the go-to-market team as well.
Thank you, Alex. Kenneth, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So my name is Kenneth. I lead fraud strategy here at Row. I've been in the banking space, in corporate banking for a couple of years, and then most predominantly the last 3 years focusing in fraud risk in the fintech sector.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenneth. Last but not least, Ria, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Elena. So hi, everyone. My name is Ria. I'm a product manager here at Unit21, and I've been leading the real-time monitoring product over the last year. So very excited to share more in today's webinar.
Thank you, Ria, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today and share your expertise in this webinar. All right, before we jump into the brass tacks of real-time monitoring, Alex, could you walk us through a brief background of how we arrived at this particular juncture?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really happy that you positioned this first topic as real-time monitoring, because this is what we will discuss. And it's important to understand where we are today versus where we were in the past. So if you think about it, real-time transaction monitoring started a long time ago, pretty much 30 years ago, when we started online shopping, right? We had credit cards forever. And, you know, if you remember the beginning, credit cards were all used to be, you know, swiped at the merchant, or, you know, use this old fashioned thing where you will see the receipt of the credit card. But when we really start seeing real-time transaction monitoring in banks is where the online shopping started, right? At that point, banks understood that what's happening online must be seen in real time. So real-time transaction monitoring is not new. What's happening over the past 20, 25, 30 years is that, except for online shopping, we are introduced now to online banking and mobile banking. So there is a whole set of new needs to monitor in real time. So we're no longer focusing, if you think about it, on the transaction. And card transactions are not the only transactions that happen in real time or near real time. So we have a lot of different payment rails that are operating in real time. But what we're seeing really forward-thinking banks doing today is that they have a very holistic approach on what is needed to be monitored in real time. It starts from how the customer is accessing their account. So any login session should be monitored in real time. After the login session has happened, hopefully it was successful and verified by the bank and the user, and we establish a good login session. What's happening with the account? So all the changes that might happen to an account, whether it's change of PII, phone address, mobile phone, maybe add a payee to the account, maybe order a new checkbook, order a new credit card, change your PIN. So everything that's happened on the mobile, on the app, how do you monitor that in real time? And obviously the third part is if we do have a successful login session, but it's a bad actor, so somebody has to cover our customer's account, how we can learn from monitoring all those non-transactional activities in real time, which they usually follow up by money movement out of the account. How we can catch it in real time. So I think it's important to emphasize that we started real-time monitoring focused on transactions, but today there is a whole lot of different transactional and non-transactional events that we should monitor in real time. Now, the other challenge is, if you think about it, the banking infrastructure of 20, 30 years ago was way different than what we're seeing today. The biggest differentiator is that 20, 30 years ago, everything was implemented on premises. And when everything is implemented on premises, it's much easier. I wouldn't say easier, but it's less sophisticated to build those real-time capabilities because you have less of latency to deal with, and you have more control because everything is running on your server. But now with the rise of fintech and the rise of neobanks and everything is cloud-based and API-based, how do you keep real-time capabilities in place for all those companies who, at the end of the day, they want to bring finance more accessible. They want to bring finance to the majority of the population. So if they become more flexible, at the end of the day, fintech is really about bringing more financial capabilities to the masses, how we can keep supporting them in real time, and how we're making sure that if they're operating on the cloud or if they're operating in an API-based environment, they can still have real-time capabilities.
Wow, that's a really good history lesson right there. There's a lot that's changed from the first time I even shopped online to today, where I'm shopping a lot on Amazon and other different vendors out there. Thank you, Alex, so much. Ria, do you have any insights to add here?
Yeah, honestly, Alex covered a lot of ground. So not too much to add, but what I will say, like as we moved from on-prem solutions to cloud-based solutions to now open banking, data is moving more and more quickly, and more data is being generated and is being available to use. So as that has happened over the past, say, decade or two, it is more and more important for financial institutions, especially banks and credit unions, but also other fintechs, to embrace advanced analytics and real-time monitoring to extract insights from all of that data, identify trends as soon as possible and as early as possible, and then also ensure timely responses to both risks and opportunities. It isn't really possible to have next day alerting anymore, or even delayed alerting where it's 10 or 30 minutes after the fact of an action being taken or a transaction being taken. You really need to move forward with the times and start to have something that is a little bit more real time, a little bit more comprehensive, to be able to keep up pace with all of the fintechs that have been disrupting the traditional financial system.
Got it. Thank you, Ria. That is actually a really great lead into the next topic, the difference between fraud detection and fraud prevention. If the goal of this discussion is to share how risk teams are moving from fraud detection to fraud prevention, we first need to define what that means. Alex, could you drill into a little bit what we mean by that?
Yes, absolutely. I think the base of understanding fraud prevention is understanding that you introducing friction. And what that friction is who is impacted by this friction, and at what point you should introduce that friction, right? So before you even thinking about the friction part, you need to understand the payment rails you're operating on. Maybe you have some payment rails that not necessarily need real-time monitoring, especially if they are processed in batch, or especially if you have some time to respond, like the cutoff at the end of the day. So maybe real-time monitoring is not necessarily needed. So you can prioritize and say, okay, I will do faster monitoring or real-time monitoring, but it's not my top priority. So which payment rails you do need monitor in real time? Those are that execute transactions in real time or near real time, where you have usually a few seconds to respond whether you approve or decline a transaction. But you also need to take into consideration your ability to recoup the funds. So for example, if you process transaction really fast, but you monitor after the fact, what your capabilities of recouping the funds in the instance of fraud, or in the instance of your customers actually telling you, this wasn't me, I want to dispute this transaction. So this is the very basic of understanding where is the need for real-time monitoring. The next part is really understanding that real-time monitoring at the end of the day will create friction for your customer. So what that friction is, obviously, if you decide to decline a transaction, somebody will be impacted by that decline, and it usually will be your customer. Hopefully it will be the fraudster who will try to make the transaction, but sometimes it will be the customer. So it's important to understand before you deploy any real-time solution that has built-in friction in it, you need to understand what is the impacted population of that rule, of that strategy, and understand what is the expected fraud rate from that strategy. And if you feel comfortable with those numbers, and those numbers are supporting your general KPIs as a fraud manager, this is where you can go and implement those frictions.
That absolutely makes sense. So it's not the first question you ask whether or not I need a real-time monitoring solution. It's really understanding, okay, what is your payment rail? Do I need it? What is the impact before even thinking about that? So that absolutely makes sense. Kenneth, do you have anything else to add?
No, I like how Alex mentioned friction, because that's a delicate balance. As you know, fraud is it's not static, right? It's dynamic, it's evolving. Alex alluded to that in a matter of seconds, you could be blocking a transaction, or you could be exposed, right? So the latency of catching real-time fraud is critical, especially in the instances of credit card transactions, as he alluded to, disputes. And I think one of the most important things that I employ, and the way that I operate as a fraud fighter, is balancing the friction with a data-centric approach. So as he alluded to, you have to understand exactly the behavior of what your customers are doing, right? You have to understand exactly what your past fraud was. What were those data points that drove that fraud? Be able to dissect that and then implement rules and strategies around that. Now, that sounds really granular, but in my approach, it's sometimes pulling the data on a spreadsheet, sometimes pulling it via SQL, anything that you can do to get the granular data to understand it. And then from there, building out real-time solutions, because the impact there is being able to assess critically on your profile what the rule is going to do, right? You could be declining a whole bunch of transactions. You could be targeting certain types of transaction presenting a risk. All in all, data is incredibly important to catch real-time fraud, and also balancing the customer experience, because you don't want to decline your legitimate customers dependent on what type of business you are, what type of fintech you are operating in, different sectors. You want to be able to offer the customer-centric experience, even from the fraud perspective. So that's what I'll add.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. So it's even when you introduce a new solution, you have to think about the customer itself also as well. What is the impact of the customer perception and the brand awareness? So if you decline a transaction, is it necessary to decline a transaction? Because if you do it and it's a real transaction, you might upset the customer, and we definitely don't want that. So it's really thinking about different types of customers you have. So that absolutely makes sense. With that, I think we can move on to the next topic. What are the current challenges with real-time monitoring solutions? Ria, I'd love to get some of your perspective. We know there are challenges with real-time monitoring with majority of legacy infrastructure. How is this impacting organizations?
Yeah, that's a great question, Yelena. So a lot of legacy systems, they often lack the agility to provide instant insights into transactional activities, action activities like logins, or password changes, which makes it really difficult for organizations to detect and respond promptly to potential anomalies. So if you're really only seeing things that look off 10 minutes after the fact or next day, it's really difficult to take the action necessary to mitigate a potential risk before it actually leads to financial loss. So, delays really leave organizations susceptible to fraud, and also hampers their ability to address issues like unauthorized access or account takeovers in real time. If someone has changed their password and is trying to immediately withdraw funds, it's important to be able to stop that, within minutes of the password being changed and the funds being withdrawn, rather than, waiting until the next day or even waiting until, 30 minutes have passed from when that initial account takeover took place. So as financial transactions occur at higher and higher speeds, kind of moving from ACH to same-day ACH to RTP and FedNow, the inability to keep up can result in a delay in the detection of fraud, leading not only to financial losses, but also damage to organizational reputation. So if you do choose to, allow your customers to use RTP and FedNow, for example, and they start to see a lot of fraud. We've kind of seen this with Zelle, where not a lot of people really trust Zelle because of fraud via Zelle. That can, again, lead to organizational reputation, just alongside the financial loss that you would experience as well. So in a world where fraud is evolving pretty rapidly, the real-time monitoring gap in legacy infrastructure is a really big risk. Organizations do need to modernize their monitoring capabilities to enhance how quickly they can respond, mitigate potential financial losses, and maintain, I think most critically, the trust and confidence of their users and their stakeholders.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And that's a really good time from what we were just talking about with customers' perception and brand awareness. What about another thing about dependency on engineering? Say if I want a real-time monitoring solution, but it's really difficult to implement, or if I make changes to it, it takes a long time. Like how, and that's a typical thing with legacy infrastructure. Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, definitely. So I think this is a problem both with legacy infrastructure and with homegrown solutions. So if you use legacy infrastructure, oftentimes they will ask you to reach out to their customer success representatives to create a rule, to tune a rule, to change a threshold, and basically be able to edit your rules so that you're responding to fraud attacks or you're reducing false positives. On the other hand, if you have a homegrown solution, yes, you might not need to reach out to, an external vendor, but you might need to reach out to your IT team and say, hey, we've seen this type of fraud. Can you help create a rule to deal with it? Or, hey, we're seeing a lot of false positives. Can you please help us tune this threshold or tune this rule so that we still have the true positives that we care about, but have fewer false positives? And that leads to a lot of time, a lot of delay. And again, as things start to move faster and faster, people just don't have the time or the resources to spend, reaching out to these third parties, whether they're vendors or internal IT teams. So one thing that's been really important to us as we've built out Unit21 is empowering the trust and safety professionals themselves, whether they're on the fraud team, the risk team, or the compliance team, to create, modify, and put into production rules as soon as they feel the need to do that. So for our real-time monitoring solution, which I know we'll get into later, we do allow customers to kind of create these rules on their own, validate them, put them into shadow mode, and then put them into production without having to reach out to anyone on the Unit21 side or anyone, on their IT team, which streamlines the rule creation process and just makes fraud mitigation a lot faster and honestly, probably also more fun because you don't have to go through all of these people to make changes to your program.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ria. Kenneth, in your experience on the user side, do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, and resources. It's generally a challenge for risk leaders to have those resources, because generally, if you're your function is not viewed as a business partner to the business, that generally poses a challenge, right? I think if you're afforded those resources, yeah, it's simple, right? You work with your engineering team to implement the solutions here. But I think in most cases or not, people don't have necessarily those resources. So a third-party vendor is where a lot of fraud folks focus on and put their eggs in the basket per se, right? And it's also important that maybe some fraud folks are not technical in nature. So having a rule engine that's very simple, being able to put a rule quickly in place, understanding what is happening is critical, right? And I would also say that in my 3 years of fintech, I've experienced both. You either have no resources, you have resources, you're scrapping for product and end resources. So it's also making sure that you advocate when necessary to build out the RTM that is needed to prevent fraud.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kenneth. Well, building on the insights into the challenge of real-time monitoring with legacy infrastructure, let's transition to our next topic, how Unit 21 is actively addressing and solving these issues in real time. Alex, I wanted to pass it back to you for this. You've been on both sides of the fence as a head of fraud risk at Lilly Bank and now as head of fraud risk at Unit 21. What does fraud fighting with Unit 21 look like and help risk teams accomplish?
Yeah, I think if I echo what Ria and Kenneth just shared, it's really important to understand how your internal reaction cycle looks like. So from the moment you identify the fraud to what internal process you have in terms of analysis and understanding, okay, if this fraud is happening, who are the customers who are impacted versus the general population, then coming up with a strategy to prevent it, going through the deployment process, testing it and promoting it into a live environment. So your whole reaction cycle should be ideally as small as possible, as fast as possible. And sometimes those built in-house build systems or being dependent on engineers is what really making this process, this reaction cycle is very long. I think for me, fighting fraud with Unit 21 is essentially helping my team making the best decision in the shortest amount of time. At the end of the day, when you look at risk and compliance infrastructure, that's what this tool, that's the bottom line of the tool. That's what you're supposed to get from the team, right? And when we talk about reducing fraud losses, it's not only blocking the fraudulent transaction. It's not only about that. Having a real-time monitoring starts with a rule that generates an alert that will have a consequence on the fraudster or on the customer. But really, it's just the beginning of the journey. So you decline the transaction, but what's next? You need to have a whole process built in of what happened after the transaction is declined. If it's a true positive, or if it's true, let's call it a fraud, right? If it's a fraud, then there should be a process of you reaching out to the customers, verifying that they didn't do the transaction, and then there need to be operational process of if it's a card transaction, you need to replace the card. If it was an account takeover, you need to go through a process of either recovering the account or creating an account for the customer. If it was a false positive, and let's say we were wrong and we declined a legitimate transaction, how fast can you validate that with the customer, whitelist this person in order for them to go and make the transaction again? Because at the end of the day, if you decline a certain transaction, you have very small amount of time to make it right for the customer, because they will take a different card, they will take a different wallet, they will use a different payment method, which is usually your competition. So you're losing business. So it's important to focus on preventing fraud, but it's not only about declining transactions. And I think the other side of this is, if you are a fraud manager in a financial institutions, you need to read your KPIs very well. And when you work on your KPIs, when you see with your senior management, those KPIs should be realistic. If your senior management expect you to reduce fraud losses or to be under a certain basis point in fraud losses, you need to have the right tools. So if you're thinking about buying a real-time solution or buying a vendor that can give you those capabilities in the future, when you discuss KPIs with your senior management, that is definitely a good time to bring that to the conversation.
Mhm. Awesome. Thank you, Alex. That was a lot to consider. It's like you said, it's not just about blocking transactions, but thinking about, the amounts of alerts it creates, how does it, impact the customer experience? Like, what are the next steps afterwards? There's so much to think about than just that one part of it. Ria, what sets Unit 21 solutions apart from other real-time monitoring solutions out there?
Yeah, great question, Yelena. I think there are a couple of things, some of which we've already kind of touched on. So to start, being able to write, test, and deploy rules in minutes without engineering support, without IT support on your end or on the Unit 21 end, is probably one of the things that sets us apart the most. If you see the right-hand side of this slide, you see what the drop-down builder looks like for real-time rules. It's supposed to look like sentences. So flag a transaction when the amount is equal to, or when the amount is greater than something. And when the entity, custom data, or the status is equal to something else. So it's meant to be very easy for non-technical users to use, which is especially helpful, as Kenneth mentioned, if you either don't have access to engineering resources, or if you have a team that isn't super technical, but is very, very good at their job and know what rule they want to put into place. They just, aren't able to code it in. So I think that's one thing that makes Unit 21 really stand out. The other thing is the ability to look at not just transactions and not just transactions of a certain type, but any event in Unit 21. So that can be a transaction, that can be an action like a login or a change password. So you can really evaluate any information that you send into the Unit 21 platform. And then you also get a response within 250 milliseconds. Now, I know we're not allowed to say that that's the fastest in the industry, but I think it's pretty close to being one of the fastest. So 250 milliseconds is very, very quick. And that's what we promise when it comes to the evaluation of any event that's being sent to our API. And the last thing is we are very focused on making whatever we create easy to use for non-technical users. So for example, when it comes to reviewing the results of a rule evaluation, we make sure that we log that all, not just at the API level, but also in the application. So you can go to any transaction, you can go to any action and see, okay, which rules ran on it, what was the result of those rules running on it. And that really helps if you need to optimize a rule because you're seeing too many false positives, or if a customer complains and says, hey, you stopped this transaction from going through, what happened? It's really easy to go in and look at exactly what happened in Unit 21 and not have to reach out to your engineering team to figure out like what was the result of the API call that we made, on X date, which is just, yeah, it's ridiculous for anybody to have to do that. So we make sure that you don't have to do that and have everything you need in the system itself.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, and 250 milliseconds is fast. It's less than a blink of an eye. So that's very, very quick. So, okay, awesome. What about the types of rules that we can support at Unit 21? What does that look like?
Yeah. So there are a couple of different types of rules that we support currently, and I will say we're constantly adding new types of rules that we support. But to start, you can run rules on any transaction or action property, including both custom data and standard data. So on a transaction, you might have some standard data like status and amount. You can obviously run rules on those. But if you have custom data like transaction internal risk score, you can also run rules on that, which is one of the things that I think makes Unit 21 super powerful, which is we give you access to all of your custom data to be able to use in rules. So that's one thing that I think is pretty exciting about our real-time monitoring solution. In addition, we also allow you to do simple historical deviation. So flag if a transaction is greater than the average amount the customer has sent in the last week, or flag if it's greater than 100% of the average amount they've ever sent. Because if someone usually sends $100 and now they're sending $1,000, that's probably a concern. So it makes it really easy to flag issues like that. We also have match list rules. So flag if a transaction is going to an IP address that has previously been associated with fraud, or if it's being sent from a high-risk country. Because a lot of I think a lot of businesses have different risk tolerances, but they can create their own lists of, bad IP addresses, high risk countries, bad device IDs, and then use those lists in rules, and especially in real-time rules, to block or hold transactions that might be fraudulent or might be risky. The last type of rule is newly seen, which I'm most excited about, which is, flag if a transaction is being sent to an account that this person has never sent money to before, or flag if a transaction is being sent to an IP address that this person has never transacted with before. And the reason why this is really exciting is because a lot of fraud ends up being, sending money to a new account, sending money to a new user, above a certain amount. So if you can combine, a newly seen rule with a match list rule, with a transaction property rule, you can probably prevent most, threatening real-time fraud from occurring, whether it was caused by ATO or a scam or something else entirely. People usually are sending money to someone they've never sent money to before. So this makes it really easy to catch that in real time.
Yeah, those are a lot of good examples of the different types of real-time fraud that we can catch. No matter what kind of organization you are, B2C, B2B, we can have those rules in place. So that was really awesome, Ria. What about if a customer wanted to not only just stop the transaction, but they want to raise an alert? How does Unit 21 help?
Yeah, so that is actually built in right into the rule creation flow. So when you create a rule, you can decide whether you want to just instantly respond to it or if you want an alert generated. So what we usually see people doing is for high risk rules, they will immediately respond. So if this rule fails and it's high risk, we just want to block the transaction. We don't even want to entertain it. Versus if a medium risk rule flags, what they might want to do is instead generate an alert that then is reviewed. So they'll put the transaction on hold, generate an alert, have it reviewed maybe within 10 minutes or maybe within the same day, and then decide what to do with it. So that is just a part of the normal rule creation process. Again, don't have to build out anything in addition, don't have to reach out to engineering. It should be really simple for anybody to do. And then if you review a transaction and you realize this customer is actually good and we've gotten a couple of alerts from them or for them, but we've investigated them, they're not a problem, you can just white label good customers so that you don't continue flagging on them and so that they're able to, take their holiday in France without being worried about being blocked for making a transaction or make transactions to a certain merchant without that being flagged on Unit 21. So that makes it really easy to deal with, the full life cycle of alert investigation. You create the rule, you decide whether or not you want to automatically respond or generate an alert. And then after you investigate alerts, you can white label good customers so they don't keep flagging.
Awesome. Well, that's a lot of good info there. Thank you so much, Ria, for giving some insights into our Unit 21 real-time monitoring solution. Alex, what would you say to our audience if they're interested in learning more?
I think Ria just gave a great speech on our real-time capabilities, but really, Unit 21 is an infrastructure that, just like you said in the beginning, and the real-time capabilities is only one tool of a much larger set of tools that we offer our customers. I think if we realistically speaking, there is no one fraud solution for financial institution out there that can cover everything they need, right? And when we look at our more forward-thinking and advanced customers that we have in Unit 21, what we usually see is that they use Unit 21 as their infrastructure platform, and they will plug in 5, 6, 7 different point solutions that are relevant for their line of business. For example, if you're onboarding customers online, that you probably have a KYC vendor, right? If you have a KYC vendor, chances are you running those KYCs when you onboard the customers, but you never use this data again. It just sits dead in somewhere in the database. You already paid for that information. You just don't use it after onboarding. Right? If you're operating in the mobile space and you have a mobile app, then you probably have a vendor that provides some device risk insights. So maybe you have installed their SDK on your app. But again, probably after the login session has happened, you never use this data again. So what we see for those customers who really look at fighting fraud and being compliant and preventing risk is that this data is being used over and over and over again, and it's not being siloed. So the teams that responsible to prevent fraud and responsible for monitoring money laundering and responsible filing SARs, obviously. They keep using all the available data in the bank and the financial institution to do their job. And like I said earlier, our job is to make sure that the analysts can make the best possible decision in the shortest amount of time. So we have a lot of capabilities around, what type of rules you can generate. Those rules can be as simple as, having a scenario that you don't really have to think of too much about how to build it. You just put a transaction threshold, or you can go to our dynamic model builder and create something very, very sophisticated. And when the alert is generated, how do you investigate the alert? So we have a great belief in Unit21 that we don't want to focus on the transaction level, and we rather look at the customer lifecycle. And our alert investigation is pointing the agent, the investigator, towards that. So entity level investigation, understanding how the entity is interacting on your platform from the day it onboarded, how it's interact with other users. We have capabilities for network analysis and visualization tools that help you understand how this entity is interacting with other users on your platform. And then you see all the historical transaction in front of you, and you can make really good decision, informed decision, based on all the data that you ingested into Unit21. So if you want to learn more about Unit21 as an infrastructure, whether or not this is the right tool for you, you're more than welcome to scan the QR code on your screen, and we will be happy to demonstrate our capabilities to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex. Wow, that's a lot about Unit21. And with all that as the backdrop, let's dive into Row. Kenneth, as a refresher, will you tell us a little bit about Row, your business, your customers, and how you approach risk?
Yeah, thank you. So Row, we're a platform to make finance frictionless for businesses. So we're a corporate management. We offer a corporate card. Generally, our customers are mid-tier businesses, VC-backed. So you can imagine the type of profile of our customer and the types of rules that we need to employ is very dynamic. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Particularly, what we've used Unit21 for was historically in the beginning for post-monitoring. But now that there's an RTM function, we're currently exploring using some of their match list rules. We currently use some of the real-time rules for some of our ACH polls. And we're excited to continue to test and use the product more and more as it becomes a more evident problem, not just for Row, but just fintechs in general. So.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so it sounds like your business is very dynamic and you're growing. Like, how does Unit21 help you, your team, as your business evolves?
I think most importantly, the Unit21 has been agile, and I think our relationship with Ria and listening to the product roadmap, we have currently standing calls. We have a team lead on our side that is engaged in these conversations, and I think it's the biggest thing is Unit21 is willing to listen to the feedback, make adjustments accordingly, tune their ear, and being able to build solutions to fit the clientele and the product type that they're trying to achieve here. Right. Most certainly for us, like we have a lot of real-time rules that block on certain ACH types polls for greater, larger amounts. And again, we're exploring the other functions for card transactions and being able to stop the fraud immediately. So.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense. So now that you have real-time monitoring, one thing I heard with Row is like, what about like catching the things that you weren't catching before? Like, how does that look? Right now you have the real-time monitoring solution. You didn't have it before. Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, I think with any fraud fighter in the space, you have to take wins, you have to take losses, right? Any vendor you use, especially in Unit21, we can build the rules, we can react accordingly. But I think for the success of Unit21 is that the product is improving. We're able to leverage these rules and we're able to stop more and more fraud. And we can only improve from there as what any fraud fighter would do, right? It's not a perfect system. There is no way that any person within the risk and fraud space would be able to mitigate 100% of fraud, but being able to have the fraud tools in place to mitigate the highest risk of fraud. So.
Yeah, that makes sense. As you were speaking, one thing that I remember in the beginning of this conversation is you're talking about how important data is. Now that like you have a little bit of understanding about like Row and how you're using that real-time monitoring, Why is data so important? Like, how are you guys using data and capturing that and getting it? Because data can live in a bunch of different silos also as well.
Yeah, Alex mentioned the customer life cycle, right? Card transactions or any sort of banking transactions is only a singular point of what the customer story is, right? As you mentioned, fraud is not just looking at one singular point. You look at it from a KYC and KYB perspective. You look at it from a top of funnel, right? You have to understand what's our customer being onboarded, what's their risk profile, what presents risk from a fraud and compliance and AML risk. Then when they actually become a customer, you have to understand their behavioral pattern. You have to understand the device intelligence, what exactly they're logging in from, what exactly their card transactions are, what's their behavior, what types of banking transactions, how do they fund their account. It's almost to say that AML and fraud has kind of merged in fintech, where we use this fancy Turco-Framel model, where fraud and AML is almost one and the same, right? And we think about the risk that we try to avert, right? When I talk about data, I've always been afforded the ability to learn data, and I'm a data analyst at heart. SQL is my bread and butter. And understanding exactly what is happening, being able to query your own data will help you drive better solutions that you want to build. I think most folks in the space, if you don't have access to the data, you're siloed because you're not seeing the bigger picture. You're not seeing exactly what is happening on a macro level. Until you can actually see it from a macro level, you can look at the data specificity and build targeted rules towards what you want to achieve. So let's start there.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And like, unless you have that data, you're just kind of throwing that dart at anywhere and not the bullseye itself. And that could introduce like friction that we talked about in the beginning also as well, because now you're going to, decline transactions that are good and thinking that they're bad. So it's really important to have that data. What about the transformative impact on the operation side with the real-time monitoring solution? Like, can you elaborate a little bit on that too, if there's anything on the operation side, like with the impact?
Yeah, I think for Unit21, depending on your size and tier of your fraud teams, or the size and tier of your transaction monitoring team, being able to have a tool that is simplistic in its UI and being able to disposition alerts is very critical, right? And I think one of the things that I remembered when I was working at Lilly was that we were using the tool, and one of the features there was being able to see a matrix of all the events connected together and holistically all the activity in the Unit21 AI. And I think it's important because your analyst or whoever's working on your fraud team needs to be able to react and think about, does this alert escalate to a case? Does this alert escalate to a UAR for fintechs? Or if you're working for a bank, does it escalate to a SAR, right? So being able to have a robust tool that is simple, being able to see the data points, the transaction amount, what relationship does that transaction have in the ecosystem of where it exists, is very critical. So operationally, any tool that can provide that efficiency is always a win, because when you're looking at metrics and KPIs, this alert dispositions and how many alerts are being dispositioned, true positive and false positive rate, all of that needs to be a part of a seamless tool. Yeah, so.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you, Kenneth. Alex, in your experience, since you've been on both sides, did you have anything else to add to what Kenneth has said?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with what Kenneth shared. I think, everybody speaks about how fraud is evolving, but I'm a great believer that fraud is shifting before it's evolving. Usually fraudsters have no reason to evolve if they can keep executing the same scheme over and over and over and over again. And one of the reasons for you to become proactive versus reactive is to shift fraudsters away from your platform. That's very simple. That's your job. Uh, I think when you consider fraud prevention tools, whether point solution or an infrastructure, you need to understand how this tool will impact the performance of your team. If your team just monitoring fraud after the fact and trying their best to collect any fraud losses or recoup any fraud losses, that's great. But if your team is actively preventing fraud, declining transactions, and shifting fraudsters away from your platform, that's will be represented both in the bottom line because you will see less fraud losses, but there will be much greater impact of the fraud operations team on the financial institution, on your organization as a general. And I think that's the core of fraud prevention in a very interesting and unique time that we're at today. Everything is cloud-based, everything is API. Payments are becoming faster and faster and faster. So how do we keep up? But not only keep up, how we making sure that we're making smart, data-driven decisions in that fast-facing space.
Mm-hmm. Well, awesome. Thank you, Alex. Okay, home stretch here. That was a really good segue into the last wrap-up topic slides. Is there any other closing thoughts that you can share to our audience if they're considering implementing a real-time monitoring solution? What would they be?
Yeah, I'll go back to payment rails, right? Understand on what rails you're operating, understand how fast or how slow you see the transactions happening. At the end of the day, when we talk about moving from fraud detection to fraud prevention, fraud detection is essentially the visibility, right? How fast or how slow we see fraud happening on our platform, and can we find any like zero visibilities, any gaps where fraud happened but we haven't even seen it. Fraud prevention is really about what actions do we take on visible and non-visible fraud in order to prevent fund losses. The next point will be making sure that your reaction cycle is as short as possible. So try to map up your reaction cycle and see where is the problem. Do you have problem with analytics where you see fraud happening but you don't know how to analyze it, you don't know the impact on your general population? Is your problem is with deploying the solution? So you understand the problem, you just don't have the solution to prevent it. If you have a solution in place but it takes you too long to deploy it, to test it, and move it to production, is it an engineering resource problem? Is it the solution is too old? So understanding your reaction cycle and where you have problems in your reaction cycle. Third point will be making data-driven solutions. I think Kenneth touched a couple of times on the importance of data and not just looking at a singular transaction. Look at the customer life cycle, understanding different customers have different risks associated with them, and how you can create a flexible strategy that can, on one hand, to provide the opportunities that your product is designed for your customers, on the other hand, keeping the customers and the company safe, and making sure that you keep building a good relationship and trust with your customers.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Kenneth, do you have any actionable advice that for our audience to take away from today's event?
It sounds cliche, but you have to be agile. I think what Alex alluded to is fraud is evolving. It's just not something that you can think you can get comfortable with. So, I would advise that, with any person that's in the fraud function, to look at things always from a macro level, right? And being able to isolate the right data points to the solutions, right? And also be customer centric. I think what a lot of fraud folks that I've experienced in my career is that, yes, we want to stop the fraud, but we also want to provide the best experience possible, because your fraud function should be viewed as an equal business partner to the business, right? And so being able to have good rules, being able to have processes in place operationally to make sure that your senior leadership understands the implications of fraud and when the fraud wins from a success point of view, and even sometimes admit the failures. So agileness, data, being able to keep up with the trends that's happening in the industry is also important. So like joining webinars like this, reading up on it, and just being actively involved in the community. So.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenneth. Ria, are there any last closing thoughts that you would like to share?
Yeah, I think Alex and Kenneth covered all of the important bits. I think the only thing I would say is like start now rather than wait until the fraud losses become quite large or there's a lot of pressure to start to modernize your tech stack. I think sometimes we hear from like banks and credit unions, we aren't offering RTP yet, or we're not offering FedNow yet. So there isn't necessarily a need for us to have real-time monitoring, but we kind of know where the trends are going. And so the earlier you can get ahead of it, the earlier you can get, real-time monitoring in place, processes in place, people in place, to become more agile, like Kenneth said, and start to use more data, the better. So the big thing for me is, like start now, don't start once things get really bad, and there's a lot of pressure to get a certain thing done.
Oh yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Thank you, Ria. Well, that about wraps up our panel discussion today. Thank you so much, Alex, Kenneth, and Ria. That was a fantastic program. We hope the insights, practical experiences, and best practices shared today will serve as a North Star in your organization's journey towards a real-time fraud prevention strategy. Thank you for joining us today. Next up, we have the Q&A section. And so we have a few questions from the audience. So let's see how much we can address. First up from Kenta. The question is, so the company will be able to write rules and implement them right now without going through Unit 21. Wait, I don't think I understand. Oh yeah, okay. Let's move on. So, okay, from Elizabeth, can a rule be created based on velocity, such as money coming in over 10K and then being quickly sent out? I think that's one for you, Ria.
Yes. So velocity rules can be created. So you can look to see how much money has come over or come in a certain amount of time, and then very quickly if it's being sent out. So definitely something that's possible to do, something we see quite often. I will say this is probably more of a scheduled rule. So you want to see maybe over the past 5 minutes, how much money has come in, or over the past day, how much money has come in, and then how quickly it's being moved out. But definitely possible to do. Another type of velocity rule we hear about a lot from customers interested in real-time monitoring is, can you tell me if somebody makes 10 transactions, like card transactions in 1 minute, or 100 card transactions in 10 minutes? So this is something the Row team has actually asked for. So we are speccing out, how to allow for those types of velocity rules. But I think that's the next step in terms of enabling velocity rules in real time.
Got it. Thanks, Ria. Okay, so this is a question for Ro from Benny. How do you actually get buy-in from leadership to invest in a real-time monitoring solution? Like, what are some of your tips and tricks to get that to happen?
It's a great question, right? One, you have to bring visibility to the overall losses of your company, right? You need to understand which category of losses are driving and let the numbers speak for itself, right? I think that's really important because, right, if we're starting to lose million and let's say $500,000 worth of fraud, right, that impacts your margin, especially for early stage startups or early stage businesses. Your margin is your profit, right? But I also think that being able to advocate that fraud and its risk function is a business partner, right? In order for you to scale your company, you need to have growth, but you have to also balance it with risk mitigation, right? And having that is very critical. So I would say, talk to your leadership, have candid conversations with them, show them the numbers, show them the strategies that you're trying to build. It's not going to be perfect and you're not going to get it on the first try. You're going to have multiple conversations, right? But be persistent, because once the fraud event happens where you're losing millions of dollars, right? And your leadership starts to see the importance of fraud prevention, that's where you drive that conversation through to make sure you can put RTM in place.
Awesome. Thanks, Kenneth. Okay, another question from Kenta. What is the flow of the transaction alerting to alert investigator reviewing and escalating to the investigator to do additional research to determine if a SAR is required, escalating to the bank to complete the SAR?
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So this sounds a little bit like our case management process. So generally, let's see. Once a transaction has been alerted, then there are usually different queues that a customer will set up based on the rule that was triggered, Also based on what investigators they have. They might have more senior investigators on more, high risk alerts versus more junior investigators on other alerts. But then once an investigator has reviewed the alerted transaction, then they have a couple of different workflow buttons that again are configurable to either escalate the alert to an investigator or escalate it to another investigator not escalate, but maybe move it to another investigator to dive more deeply into it, or even close the alert. So there are a couple of different workflow buttons. They can determine which workflow button makes sense. When they select it, they can add explanation as to why they're choosing that workflow button. So suppose I want to escalate, I'll press the escalation workflow button. A pop-up will come up that'll ask me for explanation as to why I'm escalating. And that'll move on to another queue or to another agent. And then that agent can then determine if a SAR is required. Similarly, they can choose different workflow buttons. And I do believe there's a workflow button specifically to create a SAR. And they can use a workflow button to move that into maybe a SAR creation queue, or maybe even to kick off the SAR creation process. And then that can be sent up by Unit21. So there's a lot of pieces involved, but generally we configure the workflow using workflow buttons. They're very configurable by each company, very flexible to do what you need to do. And then at the end of the day, it should be a very smooth running process and machine where it just goes from step one to completion pretty quickly using those workflow buttons. Also, those workflow buttons can be configured to be automatic in some cases as well. So you don't really need a person at every step of that process if you know certain alerts should always be escalated or certain alerts can always be closed out, for example.
Got it. Thanks, Ria. Okay, another question. Can you explain what data sources can be utilized by Unit21? Alex spoke of data at onboarding, but is that combined with core data?
Yeah, I can take that. So I think when you consider which data points you should provide to your fraud prevention vendor, I like to think about it as entity level data. So what do we know about the customer that can help us create more, you can call it personalized rules, right? If we have any risk attributes, if we know something from the KYC vendor, if we know something about the device that they're using, so anything we know about the customer. The second level would be any enrichment data on a transaction level. So if it's a card transaction, what we know beyond the amount, MCC, currency code, and the standard fields, what we know about the transaction. The third part should be, for the investigation purposes, is how this transaction impacted in relationship with other users, right? So if it's a money transfer, is it money transfer is going outbound out of our platform, or it going to another person in our platform? And if it goes to another person, do we expect this relationship between these two different customers, between these two different persons? So I think this is also important to understand. And finally, if you are operating in the crypto space, then obviously we do have integrations with companies who provide KYT, so know your transaction vendors like Chain Analysis and TRM Labs. So how do you take insights from those vendors and you combine them with your investigation, with your rule writing?
Awesome. Thank you, Alex. Well, we have 1 minute left and time for one last question. How multidimensional can rules be? Is there a way for rules in different domains to be combined to trigger a single alert? Example, combine a transaction rule, a matchless rule, and an action property rule to produce one alert or to block.
Yeah, I can answer that. Yes, you can combine multiple different types of rules into one rule. That is one of the core, components of our rule creation process. And you can combine them using and statements, or statements, and groups. So for example, you could have maybe 3 different groups all connected by an or statement. And in those groups, you can have and statements. So if somebody is is sending money to a high risk jurisdiction, plus the amount is greater than 1,000, flag an alert. Or if a person is sending money from an IP address that has never been seen before, and the amount is over $500, create an alert. or, and then, have another group. So there is a lot of flexibility with, the type of rule that you can create using those or statements, and statements, groups, and then also all of the different types of rules. You can combine all of them into one rule in any way that you'd like.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Ria, and thank you everyone for joining today. That about wraps up our webinar. If you'd like to learn more about Unit 21, please visit our website. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good day.